Okay, so this is part 9 of a series called Heroku Architecture Credential by Example. Um, the link to all the videos is available through a Medium article with the same title. Okay. In the previous section, we wrote basically a simple hello database example where we had some to-dos and we displayed them on the screen from a database. This time we're going to improve on that example, and we're going to use a concept called migrations. And along the way, we're going to learn about Heroku Release Phases, which is really the main point of this section. But we're going to use migrations to illustrate it. And so we're going to talk about the basic idea is we want to spend some time reminding ourselves why we're even doing this. Well, we talk about the general category called object relational mapping, TypeORM, which is a library. We're going to talk about sort of use all this together in local development and then staging and in production. Okay, so motivation-wise, I think all I'm going to say here is, if you recall in the previous example, one of the pain points we had was we had to manually go into the database to create the tables and create the data. We had to do it once locally, the second time we had to do it in staging, and then we had the third time we had to actually do it in production. And then also, this didn't allow for us really a good way of dealing with release PR apps. Release that, what are they called? They're called spacing out, but the review apps, right? We pushed right to staging when we did it last time. That's because the review apps, we don't have an opportunity to really it'll create the database automatically, and it wasn't clear exactly how we were going to get into the database before the code ran. So this will also kind of get towards solving that problem too. Okay, enough about motivation. I think we'll just go ahead and get started. So the first topic we're going to cover is we need to go into our code and back out some codes first before we can write the new code. So I'm going to close this all down and get into the code. And okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the code and I'm going to clean out sort of the database stuff. Now, one thing we're going to leave the connects library installed, even though we're not going to use it right now. High likelihood we're going to come back to it later on. There'll be scenarios where we still want to be able to write queries directly in the database, but that's going to be down the road. But I'll leave it in the project for now. But the code needs to go away. So I'm going to go into the server code. Okay, so what we don't need is, we don't need connects, and we don't need this to-do thingy. We don't need a database URL, right? We don't need this whole connect setup section here because we're not going to use it anymore. And then I don't think we need the API call to to-dos right now. Okay, so basically we're back to where we were before we added the database, right? Basically there's just one endpoint called / and it just basically does hello world. Okay, so we'll save that. Another sort of prerequisite cleanup is we need to go into the database to clean out the tables that we created, that one table we created. So, because we're going to do a different way of doing this. So I'm going to go history, because I can't remember PGs. So it's PG CLI. I'm going to copy and paste it. You can also, I don't know, if you're on a Mac, you can also just type bang 492. It'll rerun command 492, but it's this line right here I'm running. Connecting to my database. Describe my tables. There's my to-dos table, so I'm going to say drop table to-dos. Yes, and if I do DTT, I have no more tables. Okay, so I'm done with cleaning up that. So I got rid of the code, I got rid of the tables. Oh, so one thing I noticed here is during our build, let's look at the package.json real quick. Where's package.json? When we do our build process right here, build right? That basically, what that does is it takes the source code and copies it basically transpiled into the distribution folder. The problem is it doesn't wipe out the distribution folder to start off with, which can get you some trouble if you have some lingering code, like migrations in particular, that don't really belong there. So what I bumped into this when I was doing my example earlier. So there's a library that we want to do is we want to destroy the whole distribution folder every time we do a build. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to install a library. So this is like a sidebar. I'm going to do npm install with a d rim raf. Basically, it's a force removal. It's a JavaScript version of the Unix command remove, recursively remove. Okay, now that I have that installed, I can actually go in here and type in rim raf dist and then run the command. So basically this says remove the distribution folder, then do the build. So that's one quick improvement. So we can see it working. Well, let's make sure it's still, I mean, we can't really see it working, but if I do npm run build, it's going to run the, I mean, it's kind of too quick to see anything, but it did actually try to remove the distribution folder. And so one way of seeing this, I guess, is if I go into dist, wow. Okay, there's a full file called wow in there. So now if I do npm run build, hey, there's no wow folder file. Okay, so that was a kind of a sidebar. Okay, so the library we're going to use to kind of interact with our database and do all this migration business is called TypeORM. TypeORM. And you can see this is the documentation for it, right? And in here, there's installation instructions, and you can. I have it written down here. So all the instructions I have here are basically straight out of this documentation. So I'm going to leave this aside. So the first thing we need to do is there's a dependency called npm install reflect metadata. That's one of the dependencies. It's a pure dependency, so you have to install it yourself. The next one is TypeORM itself, so npm okay, so we have the libraries almost installed. Okay, there's one other change we need to do, and it has to do, I'm going to copy and paste this, and I'll explain it once I paste it. So I'm going to go into my TypeScript. This is basically the TypeScript configuration file, and this is what drives the compiling, right? And I'm going to paste in these, and then let me explain what they are once I get them in here. Okay. Okay, so I added 2 lines to my tsconfig. What these lines do is allows me to use a concept called decorators in my TypeScript. And this TypeORM library uses decorators as part of their syntax or their API. And what's important about that is that what it does is it allows you to create code that looks very declarative, but under the hood it's actually doing a bunch of stuff. But at the surface it looks like just a bunch of configuration. So it makes it very easy to kind of read and develop in. Under the hood it's actually doing stuff, but it's all hidden from you. Okay, so we'll see this by example when we get to it. Okay, so that's that. There's one other key file when you use, and it's in the docs here. It's called this ORM config file. Okay, so I've already got a copy on my desktop here because I didn't want to have to type the whole thing. But we'll go through. I'm going to copy it in, and then we're going to look through it. So I'm going to do copy tilde slash desktop type. Oh, it's ORM config. Okay, let's look at that file. So I just created this new file. Let me make it bigger. Okay, so the first thing you'll see here is I'm reading in the database URL from the environment. Okay, so in order for this stuff to work, I need to have environment variable set for the database URL, which is convenient because we already did that previously. Remember the .env file, right? There it is right there. So when we run our code, this environment variable is going to be in place, so that's good. Okay, then another thing, this is actually JavaScript, not TypeScript. That's another important thing. And that's because this code right here is used both by the server application, but it's also, there's some command line tools that will use the same configuration. And it's important, that's why it's important. It's not in the source folder, it's actually in the root. That's because that's where the command line tools will look for this. And that's where actually the source code looks for it too, like our web server code. So this actually belongs in the root. It belongs as a JavaScript file, and it has a default export, which is a config for ORM. So if you kind of look at this, right, I tell it's a Postgres database. I give the URL from the database URL, right? So we don't need any logging for now. I'm going to turn off all the verbose logging. And synchronized means don't automatically, because we're going to basically use migrations to do this work. If you turn synchronize on, it actually does sort of auto migrations for you on the fly, which is not a great, it's kind of risky for production. So I just not going to even use it. So we're going to manually do our migrations and control it more through our processes than just having it automatically work. Okay, so then this is a little bit confusing, but so you notice here there's entities, migration, subscribers, and then there's basically somewhat similar entries down here. So this part up here, these three here, you notice that they're basically pointing to the distribution folder and JS. So what these are basically, these are runtime entries, so that when the code is running, right, it needs to read these, when the web server code's running, it needs to know what objects, and these are basically objects like to-dos and stuff, right? It needs to know which ones exist, and it has to dynamically read them in. So that's what entities is about. And then notice it has to, for the runtime, it has to be in the JavaScript folder, right? Because that's where the code actually runs, not out of source. And migrations, again, same deal there. The migrations actually are in the distribution folder because that's where the actual code runs, right? Now, and then we won't talk about subscribers. It's an advanced feature, but I left it in there for completeness. We're going to do some command line tools, and it's going to generate things for us. So it's a code generator, like a code generator. One, we can generate migrations, but these, when we generate these, they're actually going to be output as TypeScript, and we need to tell it where to store the actual TypeScript like migrations, right? So this is like, which means it's in the source folder. So this is a little confusing, but basically this same file is used both at runtime and also from the command line. And that's why there's this distinction between distribution folder and source folders. Okay, may or may not make sense. We'll see an example of it as we go, and maybe it'll crystallize for you. You can also read the docs too, because this is straight up out of the docs. Okay, a lot on type ORM apparently. Okay, so now we've got our ORM config. Okay, so one of the first things we need to do is define what's called our entities. So these are basically the new, these are the kind of objects that this type ORM is going to manage. So we need to create a new folder called entity. Let me make sure I'm not confused. It was called, right, the folder's source entity. Okay. And I think I already got a copy. Yeah, I do. So I'm going to copy it over and save myself a little bit of typing. And then we'll just walk through it. So source, entity, copy, desktop, to do, period. Okay, let's go back here. Let's look at that entity now. So again, I create a folder under source called entity, and then I create this to-do. Don't worry about this red line right now. That's because I'm not importing it, so it's confused. But so, I'm importing some things from TypeORM, and whatever these are here. I'm gonna walk kind of through here how to read this, right? So again, these are called decorators. These add things, right? And they kind of describe some. They're very descriptive about what it is that they are representing. So, for example, I first define a class called to-do, but I wrap it in this entity saying, oh, this is going to be this is an object that essentially is going to be managed by TypeORM. So that's what this add entity represents. And then I define a class field called ID of type number, but then I say, oh, I add this line to it. It says, oh, this is going to be managed by TypeORM, and it's going to be managed as a primary key, and it's going to be auto-generated. Okay, so this is how you describe sort of how this schema for this object is going to be in the database. And then again, I'm going to create a name property, but then you can see that I now say, okay, that's also to be stored in the database of type text, right? So this basically describes to TypeORM how to store this object in the database with the primary key, auto-generated, and this thing as a text field. Okay, so this is what entity. This is sort of the guts of TypeORM, where you define your types here in JavaScript, and then it manages the database for you based on your flagging of fields or using these decorators. Okay, that's to do. The last thing to do is actually change your server code to actually use this stuff. So what I'm going to do here, let's see if I can do this differently here. Do I have server here? Okay, so I'm going to rename this server. I'm going to rename new -new. Well, I said net. Okay, that's fine. And then I'm going to go into here, and I'm going to go here. I'm going to say copy. I'm going to try to do the side-by-side trick again. Okay, so I'm just copying the new code over, and I'm going to do a select for compare with selected. Okay. Right, so the left side is the new stuff, and so I need to basically go through and apply. So it's not that much. So the first thing I need to do, and I'll describe what I'm doing as I go. First thing I need to do is do import reflect metadata. Why is this complaining? I thought I added that as a dependency. Let's see. Well, let me just type it in, and I'll deal with my dependencies in a minute. Okay, so then I'm going to save myself a little bit of typing here. I'm finding it somewhat distracting that. Okay, so those imported worked. Okay, I could have swore I did it. Okay. Oh, I know I did. I have a typo here. That's why. Oh, okay. Explains the problem. Okay, so I'm importing in from TypeORM this create connection, and then I'm importing in my to-do object, right? Okay, so far so good. Okay. What I'm going to do now is, so this is this create connection is asynchronous, so I'm going to actually wrap my whole code in a block that allows me to use async await essentially. So I'm going to say const start equals async. Promise. That's going to be a promise that returns nothing. So I'm going to say void. I learned this. I had to do this. Okay, there's my start command. So basically now I need to put a try block in here. So try catch error Okay, I have somewhat of a structure here. Now, what I'm going to do is copy all of this now here inside the block, right? But I'm not sure this is going to work. I mean, it's going to work. It's just it's a little bit more messy than I was hoping. But okay, okay. Where's my catch? Oh, it's down there. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so now I'm going to need to copy over this line. Okay, so I'm getting close. So I basically create the start thing. I create a connection. I have the old code here wrapped in here. Now I need to have this extra. So here I need another endpoint. And I think it's this. Aha. Right, okay. So what am I doing here? Let me see if I can get this over here so I can see what I'm doing. Let me make this. So basically I'm saying, okay, I first connect to the database and I wait for it. Then I use the connection to then find a to-do object, all the to-do objects, and then it's return the to objects. That's basically all there is to it. Okay, no, much simpler code. Let's see. I need to have a. Let's see, what am I missing here? Oh, I don't need all this stuff down here. I guess I accidentally left all this in here. Okay, I need to call start at the beginning. Okay, I gotta do that. Need to add a new line. Then I need to do it on a console log. I need to do something here. I'm missing that. So this seems kind of fragmented. Oof. Okay, don't need that slash. Okay, so I'm getting close. I guess I've neglected to copy over the starting of the port, so let me just grab this. Okay, I don't know about this strategy of doing the diffs, because it seems like it's easy to get confused. Okay, now these files are identical. Let me save this and let's look at it just individually. You get rid of this one now. Delete. Let's just look at this again. Okay, so the main things we just did in sort of a roundabout way was we added this reflect metadata, we added this type ORM entry, we imported this to-do object, right? We wrapped our startup code in this asynchronous function called start, and we call it at the bottom, right? And then the top of the asynchronous function, we try to wait for the connection, right? We set up all our express and everything, and then we just use that connection inside of our new endpoint called to-dos, which basically uses the connection to find the to-do objects in the database and then send you back. So that's it. Okay, so that's the server. Let's see. I think in theory, I don't know if it's in practice, I don't know, but the theory is we're done with the coding, but now we need to do some sort of some work here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this alone. I'm going to get out of this. Okay. Let me go back into the folder here. Okay, so right now, first thing I'm going to do is make sure this thing compiles. So I'm going to do npm run build and make sure I don't have any. Well, that's good. npm run lint, make sure I didn't introduce any linting problems. Okay, that's good. Okay, so essentially we have all the code in place, but you notice that nothing really happened with the database yet. So the question is, how do I now deal with the database here? So there's a command called it's in the bin folder of node modules. So if I go to node modules.bin type ORM. Okay, there's a command, and there's one of the commands we can run is called migration. I'm going to type it and we'll see what it does. Generate -m to do. So what this is going to do, if it works, it's going to look in the folder where all my in my distribution folder. It's going to look in there, look at the JavaScript, and look for any entities I've defined. And there should be one called to do because I just compiled it. And then it's going to use that to generate in the distribution folder a migration file. Let's see if this actually works. Hit enter. Hey, it did something. So it looks like it created in the source folder, migrations, right, it created a file. So let's look at that file real quick and just kind of squint at it a little bit. Again, this is an auto-generated file, so it's going to be a little bit ugly, but it created this thing, has some ID on it, has a name to it, it's basically defining some structure. You notice there's an up and down, right? Don't worry about the errors. This is ESLint complaining all over the place. Let me, what I'm going to do here, because this is auto-generated code, I really don't want to fix this code here. I just want to ignore ESLint disable. That's how you do this. What does this complain about? Oh, I guess I think I have to do it like this. Is that it? Oh, that's how you do. Okay, so I'm going to ignore all the linting. So if you squint at this, it says when this migration happens, it's the up, it's going to basically create a table called to do, right? And it looks kind of like what we did manually, right? Okay, and then if you want to roll back this migration, the down step, it's going to drop the to-do table. So this is all managed for you, but it's basically what we were doing manually last time. So it should look somewhat familiar. Okay, so I'm going to leave that alone. I've got a migration, right? The next step, but didn't actually run the migration. It's just, it's waiting to be run. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is, okay, next command is, I need to compile this because the trick here is that it creates the migrations in the source folder, but when you need to run them, they need to be in the distribution folder. So I'm going to do npm run build again. That will get my migration over into my distribution folder. Okay, so now I need to basically run my migration. So my database is running, it's empty. But the trick here is if you remember the config, ORM config, it needs an environment variable set for the database. So I could manually type in, database URL and then run the command. Turns out that I found a trick that works on Unix systems. So it works on my Mac and it'll also work inside of Roku. If you say cat.env, that just outputs that, right? If I type cat.env and pipe it to this xargs, it basically takes this file and spreads them across like it's really going to be one giant line. See, development true, database URL. So what I can now do is I've run these commands, and then I type in .node modules .bin / type ORM. Then if I type in migration run, let's see what happens. So now I'm setting the environment variable, so now it knows how to find the database, because when the migration runs, it actually needs to see the database. And hey, it did something. It said it was successful. So now the question is, what did it do? So if I go PG client, if I go to my database and DT, you notice that now I have two tables in here. One's called to do. So let me describe to do. So to do is got an ID of type integer. It's not null. It's inner auto indexing. I've got name of type text, not null, right? And pretty much what we did before. And then it just has an index called primary key on ID. So pretty much exactly what we did previously, but it was all done through code, not through me going in there and manually running the SQL. Okay, and then there's another table here. So basically, what this is a running list. So if I do select star from migrations, this is a running list of what migrations have run in this database. So you can see there's a timestamp of when it ran, and then what the name of the migration runs. So this is how TypeORM keeps track of what migrations ran in that database and which ones haven't, right? So then it can then sequentially apply the migrations let's say you had 5 migrations that you've defined and your database only had 2 of them applied, it would know to only run the last 3 of them. So this is kind of how this manages all that. Okay, so done with that. So we are done with local development. So let's see if this actually works, right? So if I do, so I've got my database there, I've run my migrations. Now my code can run now, right? Because in theory, all the tables that are there. So if I type in, what do I do? So I'm going to do npm run watch, let's say. Run this in development mode. Because I need my environment variables to be set. That's why I'm running it in watch mode, just as a reminder. And load my environment variables. Let's run my code. So my code should be running, and it should know how to get to localhost 5000 / to-dos. Hey, well, it didn't crash. It's still empty. That's because I didn't define any to-dos. So let me fix that problem. So this is, I'm going to still do this manually. We're going to cover this later. This is going to be called seeding, but one step at a time. What do I want to do? History, rep, PG, slant. So I need to go to bang 492 and D to-dos, to-do. Okay, so it's basically I need to supply names. So I'm going to insert into, it looks like this is the command I want. What did I just do? I don't think I actually did it. I hope not. Select, select. Let's see, delete from to do. Okay. Okay, insert B C. Okay. Select star from to do. Got 3 to dos. And hey, got 3 to dos. Okay, so we're basically back to where we were with our simple example, at least locally, right? And the key here was while we had to manually seed the database, we never actually had to run the SQL directly to create the table structure. We just basically ran this migration command, and it created the table structures for us. Okay, so next step is how do we do this? We've done everything locally. Let me close this down. Okay, so we're not quite done yet. So I'm going to commit this just because I'm just feel like I've done a lot here. So I'm not going to push it though. I'll just call it local migrations. Local migration. Okay. Okay, so the problem right now is how do we get this migration command to run when we deploy? Because I ran that command from my computer, right? So the key here is make sure this took right. So I'm all clean now. Okay, let me bring up a web page here. Heroku Release Phase. Okay, so this is a new concept. So we've only talked about the build. So if you remember right, previously we would have a build phase, which builds a slug, and then it builds, takes a release, and then it takes the environment variables and the resources, puts them all together, and it creates a release and starts everything up. Now, we don't want to do anything in the build phase, because the problem when you do the build phase, remember, if you promote up things from lower environment, like from, say, staging to production, the build doesn't happen again. So you really do not want to run like things like database migrations there, because they wouldn't actually happen when you promote. So you need something that happens even when you promote from lower, like from staging to production. And that turns out there's an extra phase called a release phase. So there's a diagram here that's super helpful. So when you push, for example, this is what's going to happen when we do our work. Right now, when you do push Heroku master, it does a build stage, which builds the slug. Okay, so that's now all the files are there. But then we can actually introduce something called a release phase with our configuration, and that will actually do extra stuff. And then, you know, so one of the first examples they give is migrate a database schema, right? That when that release phase completes is successful, it actually runs your app, right? So we're going to introduce a release phase, and it turns out it's super easy. There's basically, remember in our proc file, we asked where we had our web thing defined. We just need to add a new thing called release. And that's going to basically spin up another whole dyno, right, called a release dyno. It'll run something, basically take your environment that you have there with the slug, run something, and when it's successful, then it then starts up your actual, all your actual dynos using the code, using the same slug, right? So what we're going to do, we'll just do it by example here, right? So the first thing we need to do is to make my life a little bit easier. The command I want to run is essentially what I ran earlier, which was, let's see if I can find it, this thing. I want to run typerm so this is what I want to run. I'm going to copy and paste it actually. But I don't really want to type in this long .node modules. That's just really ugly, right? So the way I get around that is if I go into package.json, and I'm going to add a line into this called migration run. Okay, so that's a new script, and the script's going to run is just this. Because when you supply it this way with Node, it's going to automatically look in that Node module's bin folder. Actually, yeah, you just type in, right, just like I did with this TSC here, right? You don't say npm run, you just say typerm, so look in that bin folder for this command, and then it's a run migration run, right? And that should do the same thing we did, because again, this will run in a release phase where the environment variables were all set. So in which case this should all work without an extra xargs business. Okay, so let's see. So to be fair, I actually, this is kind of going in blind. I assume this will work because I didn't actually test it beforehand. So we'll see what happens. I think I am good now. So if this does everything I expect, I don't know, this seems pretty risky for me, but okay. Let's see the status here. Get status. So all I did was add that. Oh, wait, I forgot something. Oof. So I didn't put in release, right? npm run migration run. Okay. So what this says, I'm building in a release phase by just adding one entry into my proc file. And what the command that's going to run in the release phase is npm run migration run. Okay. Now, should now work. Get status. Well, let's give it a whirl. And if it doesn't work, then we'll learn some troubleshooting tips, I guess. Release phase. So, okay. So, one thing I do need to do. Okay. I do need to clean out one thing. I just remembered from previously, we had already created a table. Now, it was called to-dos, so it technically doesn't won't collide. But for cleanliness, I need to go into my databases here and clean out the old to-dos table, right? So let me go in there real quick. If I go to this one and I go into Postgres, no, that's not what I wanted, actually. Go to settings, environment, copy this, PG CLI, boom. Right. By the way, these are my credentials for that database, but interesting. I may have to rotate. You know what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have to rotate. There's a command where I can rotate my credentials on my production databases, and in fact, I'm gonna make a note to myself. Just realized. Rotate credentials. What I'll do that after, I'll look up how to do it, and then I'll do it so that you won't know how to get into my database. Okay. What am I doing here? I'm describing the table. So I'm going to do drop table to-dos. Okay, and I need to do the same thing in my production database, which is here, settings, config variables. Okay. Oh, PG CLI. DT, D, drop table to-dos. Okay. Okay, so now we're clean. Okay. Okay, so now I've got my production and my staging environment so that they're free of any table structure. And now I think I can push this, get push origin master. Now if this works right, what should be happening is, now there's a command. It should do start a build. When the build's complete, it should do a release phase, then which should do the migrations, which should then start my app again with new code, and I should be able to see at least, when I go look at the to-dos, it should at least be empty. We'll see if that all works. Now, if you look at Roku Release Phase, there is a command you can, if your release takes a long time, you can type in Heroku Releases, right? And so you can actually then see the output of the release command too. So let's check this out. So I'm gonna try it out. Heroku Releases app hello Heroku cert Larkin Tucker dash dsth. Oh, must be releases. Okay, so looks like it already did. Okay, completed. Now the command, how did it see? There was a command to see the output here. If you type in colon output, release number, colon output, and the release number is, I'm guessing it's V35. Oh yeah, there. It looks like I got some output. So this was basically when that well, okay, you can actually kind of see what happened here, right? When I ran that release phase, this is the output of what the release phase spit out. And you can see it ran the command type around migration run, and then it recognized that there was no migrations already in the database. It created the migration, started the transaction, created the table, and then it committed it. So there you go. It actually worked. So we can validate that this actually did what we expected by looking in the database. So we can actually go back to so we can go back to the database. And databases are settings. That was actually a quite handy command to see the output of that. Another way of, again, is look in the database to see if it actually did it. So if I do pgcli this, if I describe the tables, hey, I got the two tables now all of a sudden. So it did actually work. Okay, which means now, in theory, if I go to the web app, and if I go under /to-dos, I should at least see an empty list, right? It doesn't crash. I could go in and manually seed it. I'm not going to do it, right? Now let's do one more thing then. Now that that happened, we can now see that to get this all work production, all I got to do is promote to production. So staging to production, because I already cleaned out the database. So what this should do now is it should build the code. When it runs a release, it should run the migration. And then when it runs the migration, it should create the database, and then it should, yeah, so it's already done. So, and then we can see that it did something by typing in so we want to see the releases for production, which is PRD. I don't remember what I called it. PDN. I think I changed it. I guess it's production. So I'm getting all the releases, and then I'm going to list the release for production. And I want to release number 13. And we should see the migrations running. There it is, and it should be in the database because the migrations ran successfully. And then the last check is, we can actually validate that the code actually worked by going into the production app, opening it, typing in /to-dos, and that should get empty relay. Okay, so let's see what else we're going to cover here. So the key to this whole thing really was, the whole point of this whole exercise was encapsulated in the ability to do one thing, which is in your proc file, you can, where's my proc file? In your proc file, you can define, and so release is another reserved word, right? So web's a reserved word, meaning it's the web interface. Release is, this is the release phase. And whatever command you run here will happen after your build and before it runs. Okay, those are actually the two reserved words in here. Any other word in here will basically be a worker process. So you can call it worker or whatever you want. We'll do that later, another example. But these two are reserved. You can only have one of each, and they have special meaning. And the kinds of things you do in your release phase are things, remember, you don't write to your slug in here, right? Because that's your build phase. So this is going to be doing secondary things that are outside of your slug building, but that need to happen before your code runs. Database seeding is like, or database managing migrations is like the classic example of that. Okay, I think we're done with the video, and we will cover. There's more to talk about this, so we'll just pick up from this point in the next video.